Dr. Chan was well known in the area for his healing skills and knowledge of all diseases. One day, he received a very serious invitation from a farmer's house in the village. Following the tour guide, he walked for more than 20 minutes to reach the place. According to the guide, his father seemed to be in a critical condition.
"Hurry up, doctor. My father can't take it anymore."
Arriving in front of the house, the man opened the old gate and invited Dr. Chan inside. As he led the doctor inside, he hurriedly called out to his mother.
"Mother, I invited Dr. Chan to come here."
The mother had just come out, repeatedly urging him in because she was afraid that her husband's condition would not make him last long. The mother invited Dr. Chan inside while talking about her husband's situation. Her husband just got sick 2 days ago and was getting worse very quickly. The person lying on the bed was an older man with a pale face and wide open mouth and eyes rolled backwards. Dr. Chan approached to examine the man's situation. The older man rolled his eyes, panicking and continuously shouting,
"It hurts so much. They are crawling all over me. Please kill me. I'm in so much pain."
A blanket covered the older man, so Dr. Chan didn't know what the man's problem was. So Dr. Chan decided to come and see what was under the blanket. But when he approached, the man strongly reacted to Dr. Chan. He pushed Dr. Chan away. It seemed that the disease had made the man panic and no longer aware of his surroundings. But with his years of experience, Dr. Chan quickly convinced the man to be examined. Despite following the doctor's orders, the older man still seemed to be very uncomfortable and afraid. As soon as he lifted the blanket, Dr. Chan was amazed to see the patient's current condition. The older man's belly was monstrously bulged. Suddenly, the older man appeared to be in pain, as if just moving could make his whole body suffer. Dr. Chan now seemed to understand the older man's condition, so he told the older man's son and wife to hold him tightly. Both of them joined forces to be able to hold the older man down, even though he was struggling with pain. After the older man was held tightly, Dr. Chan unbuttoned the older man's shirt, revealing a tight, swollen abdomen full of veins and blood. Dr. Chan now looked thoughtfully at the large and protruding belly of what looked like tendons. They were all very large and swollen on the skin of the older man's abdomen. But strangely, these tendons could move, or rather, it looked like worms or parasites inside of him. Dr. Chan seemed to have understood the problem. He turned to take out the acupuncture needles from the toolbox. The needles were long and sharp, but Dr. Chan believed that they could definitely help the older man now. Dr. Chan just stopped thinking for a moment, then started his treatment. Acupuncture needles were inserted into the older man's belly in sequence. Dr. Chan was very good at this acupuncture method. After a while, acupuncture needles were quickly inserted all over the man's belly, and the things that looked like worms also started to stop moving. And a few minutes later, they disappeared completely, no longer visible on the skin of the older man's belly. The older man now also began to calm down, feeling less pain, and was able to rest for a while. The son seemed very worried about his father. He hurriedly asked Dr. Chan what strange illness his father was suffering from. Dr. Chan did not talk directly about the disease at this time, but he began to learn more about the time the older man got sick. Dr. Chan said to the son, "Your father had been infected with a type of poisonous parasite. If left for any longer, it would consume all of his organs. The situation is very dire." The son asked Dr. Chan if his father would be saved. The wife also said that her husband suddenly became strange a few days ago after cutting grass to feed the cows. That's when he began to feel sick. Upon hearing that, Dr. Chan quickly asked her about the location of the lawn, as he wanted the patient's family to lead him there to check it out and inspect. According to his mother's description, the son also knew the location of the lawn area. By the time it was getting dark, the son had already started taking Dr. Chan because it was around wild grass growing relatively far from their home. On the way, the son still didn't understand why his father's illness had something to do with the wild grass. But Dr. Chan still didn't explain anything. He had his own conclusions. After walking quite a distance, the son said they were almost there. They just have to go behind the cliff and they would arrive. When he arrived, Dr. Chan was amazed and also afraid. It seemed that his suspicions were correct. In front of them was a bunch of weeds, as tall as people and at first glance, as normal as any other type of weed. Dr. Chan and the son started to walk closer to the grassy area. The doctor was extremely wary, but the son didn't know what was going on. Dr. Chan walked and looked around like he was looking for something. Finally found what he was looking for. Seeing that they had been gone for quite a long time from home, and with the doctor being extremely quiet without telling him about his father's condition, the son began to worry. At this point, Dr. Chan began to explain to the son the cause of the appearance of the parasites. A parasite caused his father's illness. They were infecting and sucking blood from his father's belly fat. The parasite was born from a strange worm, and it only reproduced on this type of weed. After that, Dr. Chan started rummaging through his tool bag. The son still didn't understand what Dr. Chan was going to do. Then Dr. Chan gave the son a thick scarf that looked like it was sewn with many layers. The two began to approach the weeds, and Dr. Chan needed to experiment a bit to be sure to find something that could treat the patient. After a while of searching, Dr. Chan reached out and picked a branch of the tree which grew among the weeds. Indeed, if they looked at it with the naked eye, it would be difficult to distinguish this plant in the middle of a vast lawn. Even the son was very surprised. Dr. Chan held up the branch high and asked the son to look closely above the small leaves, which were the eggs of the parasites. At this point, the son was starting to get scared but still wanted to know what it was, so he also looked at the leaf. And indeed, on the surface of the leaves, there were some seeds, tiny as white as a grain of rice. When he tried to take a closer look, the son suddenly realized that they were eggs and covered with thin membrane-like spider silk. The son wondered, this thing was so small, how could it cause such a terrible disease? Dr. Chan didn't explain much. He just asked the son to take a good look at what he does next. Dr. Chan rummaged through his pocket and pulled out a small vial. Then he gave it to the son, telling him to apply it on his face and hands. Applying this drug would help avoid insects, even those parasitic larvae that attacked the body. After that, Dr. Chan started going deep into the grass, like he was looking for something. The weeds around here were taller than a person's head, so there was a lot of potential for danger. In the end, it seemed that Dr. Chan had found something important that could help cure the older man's illness. After reaching out to pick a tree branch, Dr. Chan showed it to the son. There were many small purple fruits on the branch, which looked very strange. Dr. Chan held it out in front of the son and told him to look for more fruits like this. It grew from the same tree on which the poisonous parasites lay their eggs. Dr. Chan told him to look carefully and pick a lot to bring back to save his father. The two began to split up to find and pick the strange fruit which only reproduced on this plant, and only its fruit could kill those parasites. In just a moment, the two were able to pick a lot of fruit. After getting out of the weeds, Dr. Chan suddenly took a small knife and cut a small cut on his finger. The son was extremely surprised but still very quiet, watching Dr. Chan. Next, Dr. Chan began to drip his own blood from the cut. The drop of blood fell directly onto the leaf containing the small larva eggs. At this moment, the son was putting the leaf on the handkerchief and holding it in his hand. What happened next made him extremely scared. After the drop of blood permeated the egg sacs, they seemed to begin to move. From within the tiny eggs, strange creatures looking like small worms began to break the egg sac and came out. At first, they were just bigger than a thread, but after they sucked all the blood on the leaf, they suddenly became as big as chopsticks. They gradually got bigger and bigger. In an instant, they almost filled out the entire handkerchief the son was holding, making him shiver with fear. At that moment, Dr. Chan took the purple fruit he had just picked. He gently squeezed the fruit and it immediately oozed a purple liquid. After that, he directly dripped it onto a parasite. Miraculously, the purple juice from the wild fruit worked. The poisonous parasite began to writhe in pain and then withered and died. Seeing these things, the son also understood what the doctor wanted to say. Suddenly, Dr. Chan seemed to remember something. He glanced at these weeds and thought for a moment. But now, it was getting dark. They needed to go home with this pile of purple fruit quickly. The doctor did not forget to ask the son if anyone had known this lawn area, and Dr. Chan began to worry when he looked closely at the weeds behind him. He was worried that if he continued to leave this lawn and this dangerous plant here, more people would be harmed. So Dr. Chan asked more carefully if this land was owned by anyone or not. Because the older man's condition was critical, they didn't talk much but quickly went home to treat him. Arriving home, Dr. Chan gave the bunch of plants to the wife and told her to get a basin and squeeze all the juice of these purple fruits into it. After squeezing the juice, Dr. Chan began to pull out all the needles that had been inserted into the older man's belly in the first place. Within those purple fruits seemed to be a lot of liquid, so a full basin was squeezed out. Dr. Chan said to the wife, "Take this wet towel and wipe your husband all over his body." This method would cause pain to the parasites and was intended to force the parasites out of the patient. Following Dr. Chan's instructions, the wife quickly wiped it all over her husband and then they allowed a few minutes so that the purple juice could penetrate the skin. A few minutes later, when the time came, Dr. Chan held a small scalpel. He cut an extended cut on the patient's wrist. This would be the way for the parasites to escape. And yes, after the purple water had penetrated into the skin, the parasites began to ache and increasingly wiggle beneath the older man's skin. They were crawling around and seemed to be looking for a way to get out. The sight was terrifying. Witnessing what happened in front of their eyes, the wife was terrified, wondering if her husband could stand it. Seeing that Dr. Chan tried his best to comfort her, everything would be resolved soon. At this point, the parasites began to appear all over the older man's body. It turned out that they had proliferated a lot in his stomach and were now trying to crawl out. The parasites eventually discovered the cut on the older man's wrist, so they started making their way there. In an instant, they began to crawl out from the wound on the older man's wrist. The scene was gruesome. Long parasites like worms were jostling to escape the older man's body. At a glance, these parasites were fat and red. It seemed that they had sucked a lot of blood from the older man's body. And after only a few minutes, all the parasites came out from the mouth of the wound. Underneath the floor, Dr. Chan also left a basin of purple fruit juice, so they fell straight into it. The purple juice began to work, directly killing those fat parasites. They withered and decomposed utterly, leaving only a pungent stench like the smell of carrion. After the parasites had all escaped, the older man's body started returning to normal. Dr. Chan turned back and informed the son and his mother that his father was out of danger. Dr. Chan advised a few more things to take better care of the older man. After a few days of rest, he would get better. After that, Dr. Chan also said goodbye to the older man's family because he needed to handle something important. Because he already had a plan in mind, Dr. Chan decided to deal with this problem decisively. Otherwise, many more people would be harmed by this poisonous parasite. That night, Dr. Chan walked towards the weed area in the afternoon. He lit a fire and burned it all. He hoped that no one would be accidentally infected with this blood-sucking parasite ever again.